Vanderbilt Center for Digital Humanities. This is the third event in our field viewing series, which has been really excited from the start. I'll just start with a few words of gratitude to our sponsors. This event series, and indeed the center itself, are supported by Vanderbilt University, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Mellon Foundation, and today, GIS Day and all of its attendant celebrations have been co-sponsored by Eugene and Alexander Third University Libraries. Before we get started in earnest with today's colloquial discussion, I'll give everyone just a quick heads up about some other upcoming events. Tomorrow, Thursday the 17th at 6:15 in Furman 132, the Gisela Mosig Invitational Lecture by Matthew Handelman will be on critical theory, Gershom Scholem, and the digital humanities. So I hope everyone can make it to that. That will be followed on Friday by a workshop discussion here in this space on critical theory in the digital humanities. So that'll be here, Budget 344, this Friday at 3 o'clock p.m. Also, after the Thanksgiving break, on Friday, December 9th at noon, there will be a talk with Maxime Durand, who is the staff historian with Ubisoft, and he'll be speaking about history of the Assassin's Creed video game series. So that should be an interesting end of semester change of pace for many of us. That will be part of a conference on immersive environments, aka video games and education, hosted by our own Literary fellow Pelagios. So, with no further ado, I'll say it is a very, very great pleasure to welcome Professor David J. Bodenhamer to Vanderbilt for GIS Day 2016. Professor David Bodenhamer is a professor of history at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. He's written extensively on American constitutional and legal history, and he continues to pursue this angle of research. In 2012, he published The Revolutionary Constitution with Oxford. For the last 2 decades of his career, he's also been very busy developing and providing intellectual guidance to an emerging area of research practice known as spatial humanities. He's the founding executive director of the Polis Center at IUPUI. This is a research center that since 1989 has, quote, I'm quoting the website here, but it's a great statement of purpose, so I'm just going to replicate it here. Has helped to lead the development of a new field of spatial humanities, which uses geospatial technologies to understand the role and meaning of place in modern society. Professor Bodenhamer is also a co-director of the Interdisciplinary Virtual Center for Spatial Humanities, which is a partnership among Florida State University, West Virginia University, and IUPUI. With his VCHS partners, he's co-authored 2 books that have been foundational to this emerging field and practice of spatial humanities. First, The Spatial Humanities, GIS and the Future of Scholarship in 2010, Future of Humanities Scholarship in 2010, and Deep Maps and Spatial Narratives in 2015. Just anecdotally, I'll also say that when the group of fellows and associates kind of linked to the Digital Humanities Center got together and started brainstorming about who we would like to invite to be a co-opening speaker, the very first name spoken was David Boden, of course. This was spoken unequivocally and immediately seconded, and from people from a variety of fields and disciplines within our core group. So it's a wonderful pleasure and an honor to have him here. Please join me in welcoming him for his talk, Developing the Spatial Humanities for More Than GIS.
Well, thank you, Mickey, and that was a far more lavish introduction than I deserve. Trust me, you'll probably come to realize that after about 2 minutes of my talk. It's a pleasure to be back in Tennessee. I took my bachelor's degree in Eastern Tennessee at Carson Newman College, a little place over there, and one of the big regrets of my life, it turns out. But nonetheless, I enjoyed my time in Tennessee, and my wife always tells me, though, that when I pass the Mason-Dixon line, my accent thickens a bit, because I'm a native Southerner. In fact, I had to call back to the office, and they told me at the end of a 3-minute conversation that I'd already dropped 10 G's. So, well, it's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the development of the spatial humanities as I don't know if we call that a discipline, a subdiscipline, a field. You can decide about that, but it's something that I think is already beginning to have some impact on the humanities generally, and I believe it'll have an even greater impact. Now, I'm going to begin by looking backward a bit, trying to, as historians tend to do, trying to set the context. Of course, you know what Nietzsche said about historians. He says they begin by looking backward and they end by thinking backward. Let's hope that's not the case here. Let's begin with postmodernism, because I think this is, you'll find this coming back into play toward the end of this presentation. We're in a postmodern era, and we've been that way since the 1970s. In fact, I began my academic career in the mid-1970s, and I very much recall the splits that occurred, especially in English and language departments, over the postmodernism. In fact, I was playing softball with the English department team, and they could no longer stand each other, so they had to split into two teams, and I had to make my choice. I went with the team that favored Derrida. At any rate, postmodernism, of course, is the radical indeterminacy of all material and symbolic forms of existence, and Simon Susan, in a recent book, talks about the tensions that occur here along this continuum, and I've listed them there, but what it introduces to the humanities are a new set of themes for us. And those themes, of course, those of you who are recent PhDs or in graduate school, these are second nature to you, but believe me, these are terms we had to learn and had to think about when I was finishing my work. But it introduced some new perspectives to those of us in the humanities as well. And you see them kind of listed here, everything from multiple realities and agency and situatedness and simultaneity, movement and flow, experience and emotion. All of these things begin to show up in our scholarship in ways that we could not have imagined in the 1970s itself. Well, at the same time that we see the postmodernism beginning to develop, we also are experiencing the spatial turn. And in fact, in some ways, the spatial turn is part of that postmodernist moment, part of that postmodernist movement. But what happens with the spatial turn is it becomes infiltrated very quickly by a technology that is not at all postmodern, that is in some ways very positivistic, and we'll see that in just a moment. This technology that supports, of course, is GIS, and it's a toolkit that is a very powerful technology that allows us to manage, analyze, and visualize spatial information. And it focuses explicitly on space. Now, in geography, GIS doesn't emerge from the discipline of geography, but it's simply appropriated by geography, because I think that of geographic in the title of the tool itself. There comes a critique in the 1990s of GIS, which is essentially that it is portraying space in only one way. It's a very positivistic and reductionistic way of portraying space. It depends upon very precise measurement. And of course, there are many other ways in which we can view space, and those ways, those social-cultural ways, are incredibly important. Now, for me, and for us, I think the intellectual problem that this poses is that postmodernism and its challenge to objectivity leads to a variety of new directions or turns that are based upon this argument that social and cultural reality are in fact linguistic constructions, that truth is a social construction. But the spatial turn, even though it identifies space as a social process, at least when coming from the postmodernist angle, it also focuses on material context, and GIS reinforces that focus on materiality. And I think these shifts are in tension with each other. And that tension creates a central problem for those of us in the humanities, and that is, how do we connect matter and meaning? Now, at first, we in the humanities, at least certainly in the discipline of history, where we began to have some of the first responses, and I'm going to excuse the archaeologists because they began to use GIS as a tool, as an instrument that allowed them to do their work more efficiently. I don't think they did it with the concept at first of a spatial humanities, and Steve may disagree with me there, but nonetheless, certainly coming out of history was a notion that we could employ this tool of GIS to help us understand the past better. And the focus here, the emphasis was on the integration, visualization, and spatial analysis that GIS enabled us to do. And we began to do a variety of things within the discipline of history, and soon beginning to spread out to the other parts of the humanities, to build an infrastructure that allowed us to use GIS more effectively within our disciplines. And we began with the creation of what we might call strategic data sets. Essentially, this was taking census data, primarily census data, and moving and geo-enabling it, spatially enabling it, so that we could use it within this. And we can see the examples of this in a variety of national historical GIS projects, and I'll show you a couple of those in a moment. There were also the beginnings of some international collaborations. Certainly, I began to participate in these in the late 1990s. And the new genres of scholarship that began to emerge, especially under this rubric of historical GIS, in cultural studies and archaeology and history and whatnot. And here's just some examples. The National Historical GIS, for the U.S., you're familiar with that one, I'm certain. There's one for Germany, there's one for China. Actually, there are two for China, one for Taiwan and one for the mainland, as you might expect. And there are probably about, at this point, around 20 National Historical GISs, either completed or in the process of being developed. So we're beginning to develop that infrastructure. There was the development of geo-rectified historical maps. How do you take these historical maps that are out there, that are in some ways one of our records of the physical past, of the spatial past, and how do we bring those into a modern GIS environment? Well, David Rumsey, a collector, a map collector, but who made his fortune 3 different times in a variety of fields, decided that he no longer was interested in making money, and he wanted to take what he had accumulated as a vast map collection, and he wanted to make that freely available to scholars or anyone else who could use it. And so he worked with a software company to figure out how to not only geo-rectify but to serve these maps quickly in an online environment in a way that could be consumed readily by GIS. He liked the software company so much he bought it. It was called Luna. And they've done a marvelous job of presenting these. And if you ever need historical maps, this is one of the places you will first start, at the davidrumsey.org. I think now he has given those maps or turned those maps over to Stanford. Okay, thank you. There was the development of a whole series of online mapping tools. Perhaps the most prominent one now is Social Explorer. It's the one being used by the New York Times for many of its visualizations. This is its most recent iteration. It's been in development now for about 15 or so years. Andy Beveridge at one of the New York universities is in charge of that. And there were these professional networks that developed. The Historical GIS Research Network, which is headquartered at Lancaster University, and the Electronic Cultural Atlas Initiative, which was one of the very first of these networks that emerged. This was one that comes out of the University of California at Berkeley. It held its first meetings in 1997, and by the early part of the 21st century, it already had around 800 universities and about 2,000 scholars from a variety of disciplines, all linked more loosely than not, but with regular meetings, thinking about how it is that we could use this technology to create cultural atlases that would be rich and robust in terms of the ways in which that they could manage data and display it and visualize it and use it within a spatial environment, at the base of which was the GIS. And there were a whole variety of projects and publications that we see emerging in the late 1990s and the early part of the 21st century, and I've just listed a few of them here. First are the projects with the HGIS components, such as the Salem witchcraft trials or E. Williamsburg. There are major HGIS projects where they really are grappling in a very intense way with how you bring this technology into the humanities disciplines. The best known of those is the Stanford Spatial History Project, but there were a number of others as I've listed. And there were beginning to be major publications and conferences in HGIS and the Spatial Humanities. And here's just some examples of this. Medieval Chester, which is Keith Lilly's project at Queen's University in Belfast, in which he wanted to take GIS and as an archaeologist, because that's what he is, and see if he could recreate medieval Chester, not just the town plat, but if he could begin to use that to build up something that would allow people to see the city in a different kind of way. Or the Salem witch trials, which comes out of the University of Virginia with Ben Ray, who's a religious studies historian, or religious historian rather, and Ben decided he wanted to look at the Salem witch trials again, but this time from a spatial perspective. And what he did was created a site that allowed you to see where it was the accusers and the accused lived. And you can go day by day through the record, and you can see that there is a spatial proximity here. even in this relatively small town of Salem. In fact, I know that Ben 2 years ago, I think 2015 or 14 or 15, published a book in which he argues now that really what's at play in the spatial witch craze, in the Salem witch craze, is a series of spatial networks that is leading to the way in which the craze unfolded. And of course, the Stanford Spatial History Initiative and the Spatial History Project, which still continues there, I think now as a center. Literary Atlas of Europe, Barbara Piatta's work at Zurich, University of Zurich, where they're trying to take and use these technologies to map fiction especially. And the Digital Atlas of American Religion, which is a project we created at my center under a large NEH grant, which takes the basic GIS technology but adds to it with some Google tools that allow different kind of visualizations off of these spatial data. And what was happening, of course, was we were rediscovering the map as humanists. And Richard White, I think, says it very well. Richard, of course, was the primary director, I think, yes, of the Stanford Spatial History Project, and he reminds us that when you place complex things on a map, you can see relationships in ways that would tend to bog down a narrative and where we would tend to get lost. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But just as occurred in geography with the critique of GIS, so the critique began to emerge in the humanities too. And it falls into these various categories. First, most of the work that was being done was really mapping spatial primitives. That is, points, lines, and polygons. That's essentially what it was. There was not much analysis to it. People were discovering that GIS requires a lot of technical expertise, especially if you're using the standard Esri software, that it's incompatible with much humanities data. Much of the data that we work with are uncertain, they're ambiguous, there's a lot of missing data, and of course GIS is a technology that requires precision, it requires completeness. But perhaps more important to the humanities, GIS was about space. It wasn't about place, and it was place that animates us as humanists. And where's time in all of this? It's not there. In GIS, time is still an attribute of space. The contributions to scholarship were debated. Yes, we could point to a few things, but for the most part, the scholarly record is not replete with examples of path-breaking GIS-based work. And then I think the most telling of all is very few humanists were picking up this tool and using it. It seems like, you know, when you talk about an IUPUI that has 2,000 members in 800 universities worldwide, but of course there are hundreds of thousands and millions of humanities scholars out there worldwide. So we weren't having very much success. Well, why? And I think there are a number of barriers that we can see. One is just systems itself. These are expensive systems. An Esri license for a university runs into the 5 figures and depends upon how many users you have, can be even more than that. The data, while there was the effort to create these strategic data sets, you know as well as I do that the censuses and those sorts of large data sets only constitute a small portion of the kind of data we use, except for certain types of projects. There was the matter of culture. We humanists tend to be solitary scholars. We work in our archives. But GIS by its nature, or any geospatial technology, requires collaboration, especially collaboration with computing experts, people who understand in a different kind of environment and use a different kind of language. And then there was, of course, the issue of literacy. It was interesting. Ian Gregory at Lancaster University is a historical geography, and I did a project where we, I think it was 2011 or 12, we published it, where we did a large survey of humanists, especially historians, and asked them essentially about spatial thinking. It's a large survey. We got about 300 responses, and it was really striking that about 80% of the historians confessed that they really didn't know what spatial thinking was. They could not define it in any meaningful way. And so we have this geographic illiteracy or spatial illiteracy in the humanities because it is not a prominent question for us and hasn't been for a long time. But I think there's another issue too, and it's visual literacy. The output of GIS is always in the form of a map or other kinds of visualizations. And oftentimes we haven't been trained in thinking about those sorts of advanced visualizations. It really is a learned art or a learned skill. Well, but at base, I think what's happening here is there's an epistemological clash that is occurring. And that is that GIS and the rediscovery of the map imagines a world in which there is rigorously measurable, infinitely shareable information across temporal and spatial scales. Well, you can see that perhaps when you have the ability to go out and to measure and remeasure objects or environments. But where does this vision fit with postmodernism's emphasis on indeterminacy and fluency and particularity and all of those other characteristics that engage us as humanists? So the real question is, can GIS fit the needs of historians and other humanists? That's the real question at heart, it seems to me. And it is out of trying to seek an answer to this question that we formed the Virtual Center for Spatial Humanities, which is this collaboration that Mickey mentioned in her introduction. Now, you would think that this is a high-level, serious enterprise, but in fact it formed because Trevor Harris at West Virginia University, who is a GI scientist, and John Corrigan at Florida State University, who is a religious studies scholar and a historian, and I, a historian, we all like to sample various beers and talk football. And that's how it came about. But we did find that we had shared this other interest in common. But our goal here is, how do we move beyond GIS and toward a really robust spatial humanities, which is a postmodern and post-structural approach that bends the technology to our needs rather than asking us to shoehorn our data and our questions into it. That's because what we're interested in is taking what is happening in GI science, which is the theory that underlies the expression that you see in GIS. How do we blend the humanities with that theory to help us understand the reciprocal influence of space and culture, space and place rather, on culture and society? Because there is this reciprocal influence. Maybe what we came to realize, was a Pareto GIS. Now, Vilfredo Pareto was the Italian economist in the 1920s who became interested in landholding patterns in Italy. And he discovered that 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the people. And he got to wondering about this. He said, I wonder if this was a pattern that existed in the past. And no matter how far back he went, he saw the same ratio. And he then began to think about, did it apply to other fields as well? And of course now there is this idea, this Pareto principle it's called, that says that 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. My wife says she believes that because I wear 20% of my clothes 80% of the time. But it has become a very important principle in such things as marketing, for instance, and trying to understand how to get people to do certain things. And part of where the notion of nudging comes from is this notion of of the Pareto principle. But really at heart, what we perhaps what this is trying to suggest is that we don't need the full analytical functionality of GIS to do our work. That's not really what we're looking for. So how do we reboot, and where do we move? And this is where I think GIS, where the spatial humanities is and where it's headed. First of all, we're moving beyond GIS. People who are doing good and serious work in the spatial humanities haven't dropped GIS from their toolkit, but they've certainly added to it in very, very dramatic ways. We're making these geospatial tools open to humanities data. In other words, we're challenging the developers of those tools to recognize issues of uncertainty and issues of ambiguity within the data. And in fact, it turns out that that's a very big interest of our own Defense Department because they have to grapple with that all the time, and yet they need that location data for matters of national security. How do we embrace a multimodal approach? How do we include other kinds of other means and other methods within this? How do we use the immersive environments that are becoming more common? How do we create collaborative spaces and develop essentially a new epistemology that is nonlinear and fluid and reflexive, those things that we in the humanities value? What I think we're doing is responding to what Franco Moretti called for in his Graphs, Maps, and Trees, and that is the kind of maps that have emerging qualities, those things that in fact allow us to see emerging realities that are there, where things are not always on the surface, but allow us to dig more deeply and to understand something about the complexities that are involved in any particular situation. And so I think we're moved into Spatial Humanities 2.0. It's no longer Historical GIS. That privilege is a tool. Spatial Humanities is broader than that. It's an explicit recognition of the reciprocal influence of geographic and constructed space on culture and society. And it fuses the traditional focus on nuance, voice, experience, and text, those things that we value as humanists, with the systematic approaches of spatial science and computer modeling, and increasingly virtual reality. The goal, of course, is to link time, culture, and space dynamically. And what's happening in disciplines other than humanities are approaches, we might call them, in fact, Daniel Swee, a geographer, calls them alt.GIS, alternate ways of thinking about this, that are increasingly becoming important in our world and becoming important in the spatial humanities, whether it's neo-geography, which is the ways in which we collect information and that is volunteered by people, sometimes not without their knowledge they're volunteering it. It's when we've got our smartphones on and we're walking in the street, we're continually volunteering that information about our spatial presence. Or whether it is they're participating in thinking about space with us and we're capturing those perspectives in ways that are important. Whether it's the kind of Google Earth, virtual globes, or APIs, story maps, all of these kind of things that are now part of our technology world. And we're beginning to see expressions of this within the humanities. This is a project that is at Lancaster University. My friend Ian Gregory is doing this. He's gotten a very large European Union grant. He won't be able to have it much longer, it turns out, because of Brexit. But nonetheless, as to what he's interested in here is how is it, can we take what computational linguists do in trying to understand language and pick spatial references out of those texts and move them into an environment where we can use them in the same way that we can use quantitative data. And then how can we use images? And his challenge here, he recognized that there were these poets who began to write about the Lake District. I guess it was Samuel Taylor Coleridge and somebody I can't remember besides Coleridge. At any rate, at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, they were writing about this not just in their poetry but in their travels, and they were creating these travel logs, we would call them, that became popular literature of the day. And it turned out, of course, what they were doing for us is creating the cultural tropes. They were creating the way we see the Lake District today. And so he was wanting to pull out of a variety of text from that period to now those ways in which that becomes structured, relating to those places that they were describing, and then to call the web on Flickr and other things to pull the images down that reflected the perspective that they were describing with their words. Well, it's a mashup GIS, essentially. He's using GIS as a core technology, but he's adding to it in a whole variety of ways, in ways that GIS was not intended to do. Or my colleague at Purdue University, Sarim Matai, who's in communication studies, he's created an app called Visible Paths, which is a participatory GIS. Now this you're looking at is the landing at D-Day, on Omaha Beach at D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. And what he wanted to do was to create something that allowed people to experience what happened at Omaha by culling or scraping the web tying it to the GIS so that when you're on Omaha Beach using this app, if there's anything that relates to that particular place, it's going to be fed to you. But importantly, if you're a veteran of that, or if you have memories of that you have learned from someone else, you can contribute those to this site. So it adds to that memory base that is important to scholars. The virtual globes, you've all seen examples of these where we can reconstruct using these, I think this is Google SketchUp, using these technologies just to allow us to see what an older building would have looked like in this space. How big would it have been? How much did it command? You're probably familiar with HyperCities, the experimental tool that was developed at UCLA with Todd Pressner and some others. I don't think this is any longer being supported. I'm correct about that. But nonetheless, it is a way in which they tried to use GIS to allow you, in a web-based environment, to add a whole variety of different kind of materials to that and to think about the ways in which those might reveal things. Or Pelagios Commons that Elton Barker, Leif Isaacson, and a whole series of scholars around Europe are trying to use linked data to understand spatial context. And the Pleiades, I think one of you in a session earlier today were mentioning is used Pleiades, which is the gazetteer for this particular project. The augmented reality, and here, and I probably should have asked Steve earlier whether Architect has in fact come about, but this was the vision with Architect to be able to create the app that allows you to reconstruct visually what you're looking at in a ruin. But Google Glass and others feeding this to you, this information to you about the particular place where you are. Or the Spatial VR, virtual reality, and this is the work of Bernie Fischer, who, when he was at UCLA, is now my colleague at the Bloomington campus of IU. This was a way of trying to understand the forum as it might have existed, as it probably did exist in the Roman times. Of course, you see the forum as it exists today on the bottom frame, but on the top is the reconstructed forum. Now, what's interesting about this is not only are you able to place yourself within that forum, you get a sense of the scale and the mass of these buildings, but you can place yourself in the forum as it is today, and you will see replicated. No matter where you are, you'll see that space revealed to you in the reconstructed forum. And they have a way of letting you choose the time, the day, and the time, so you can understand what the forum looked like at a particular day of the year, at a particular time of the day, trying to see light and shadows. And of course, there's new scholarship that is emerging all the time, and I'm immodest enough to put some of the work that I've been involved with right front and center. But there's a growing literature on this that is increasingly becoming important, I think, in at least prompting the discussion of this within our fields. And there are new forms of scholarship. This is Phil Ethington's work. Phil's at the University of Southern California. He's done what's called the Ghost Metropolis, trying to look at Los Angeles over a period of decades. Now, Phil began this work before GIS became powerful enough, or before other geospatial technologies became powerful enough, and he quite laboriously created maps that allow you to see through them to the space that has existed at various other times. But here he published this in the American Historical Review as a way of allowing you to see what he was trying to argue within in his published piece. Or the work of Zephyr Frank at the Spatial Humanities Center. Zephyr is now the director of that center. New kinds of Spatio-Temporal Visualizations. Now note, this is not GIS, but it's a way of bringing space and time together. This was the Chinese immigrant pipeline in Canada. And you see that you've got all sorts of information there for you, all of it spatially oriented, but none of it GIS. Or this is the work of Charles Travis, who is now at Texas Tech, was at Dublin. Prior to that, when he was at Trinity College in Dublin, of course, he was well aware of Bloomsday, because that was a big thing. And as he became more of a Joycean scholar than he would have ever imagined, he realized that Joyce based Ulysses not simply on the Odyssey, he also based it on Dante's Inferno. So how is it that you can construct something that allows you to see the metaphorical space with the physical space? And I think that's a very creative way to think about that. Now, it's not GIS, but it's very evocative of the kind of work. And if you're interested in this, you might look at his book called Abstract Machine, published by ESRI Press, which has a host of these kind of visualizations where he is continually experimenting with how we make the spatial real and meaningful within the humanities without depending upon GIS as a way of thinking about it. The space-time networks, this is coming out of, again, Zephyr Frank's work. Again, another way of thinking about space and time and place, or exploratory spatial data analysis in a large communities information system that we've developed for Central Indiana. We use something very similar to this, where you can work with the data and your various statistical packages, but then you can link the data through a brushing and linking technique to where it is occurring in space. And that's important. So as you can see where an outlier may be, you can find out where it exists within the geographic. This exploratory spatial analysis tool is a very powerful tool that increasingly we're going to see used. In the UK, they're experimenting with sound maps. This is not traditional spatial data, but it's how it is that you capture ambient sound so that scholars can understand something more about the place than simply what they can derive from text or from a database or from an image. The Walking Through Time site that developed, I think it was by the Museum of London, which allows you to download an app to your iPhone, walk around London, and be able to see maps of that place over time that are part of their collection that they can feed to you. Or the virtual placemaking apps that are increasingly common. This one is the City of Memory site in New York. I think it's based primarily in Brooklyn, where you can walk around, and by using the GPS coordinates, it's going to show you what it has in terms of images for those particular places and allow you to contribute. Not much like Matai's Visible Past site. Well, this has come a long way from GIS, hasn't it? These things. But I think there's still a challenge out there, and it's the challenge that was posed to us by Mikhail Bakhtin, the Roman theoretician and philosopher back in the 1930s, where he says what we need is the chronotope, which fuses time and space. And where, in his words, time thickens and takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. That's the ideal, isn't it? That's what we really want as humanists, is to be able to see these things always linked, because they are always linked in our world. They always have been linked. It is only we that have separated them and tried to deal with them as two different and discrete phenomena. Well, how do we do that? I think it's through deep mapping, and that's what I have been arguing and suggesting for some time now. Mickey mentioned the book that we've just come out with called Deep Maps and Spatial Narratives. We have another one that will be coming out, I think, next year. It's called Making Deep Maps, where we're trying to continue to push this notion that the map for the humanist has to be deep and rich and robust in ways that GIS does not allow us to do. So the goal that we have is, how do we reveal the complex and contingent context of events within and across time and space? I mean, that's the goal. And deep maps, in this sense, then, is both a platform, a process, and a product. It's a platform, meaning it's the kind of technologies we pull together to enable us to do this in the digital world. It is a process, the methods that we use, and ultimately it's the product, the thing that we produce, that enables us to engage it, or enables others to engage it as we think about the meaning of that. This desire, again, to connect matter and meaning. We're trying to link across time and space, in other words, enable the chronotope. It has to operate across, as we envision at least, operate across multiple scales, because the things that are visible to you at one scale are invisible to you at one scale, may be visible at another. because we understand that reality really is composed and comprised of multiple perspectives and multiple realities. How does the map reveal that to us at once? How does it recognize the alternate schemes of the emergent realities? How does it foster this dynamic context? How does it enable us to see the deep contingencies that we know exist in any environment? And how ultimately does it evoke the emotional and the experiential? How do we create an effective geography out of this? Now, deep mapping is an old idea. There's nothing new about this. A lot of people will point to William Lee Steep's Moon book, Prairie Earth, because it has deep map as a subtitle. And it's a terrific book. It's a stratigraphic look at Chase County, Kansas. But in fact, in the medieval world, we had this attempt to embed the map with as much information, not just the kind of spatial information, but an entire cosmology wrapped up in the map. And I think that as more I have thought about it, I'm proposing 5 types of deep maps. I don't think there's a single way in which we do deep mapping. I mean, I see at least 5, and kind of the archival, the descriptive, the exploratory, the narrative, and the immersive are experiential maps. And I think each of them, and I've tried to give you some references here to things that I have shown you, of the types that I think there are out there. And it depends upon the problem you're trying to solve, the questions you're asking, as to which deep map you're going to move toward. But there are certain design requirements that it seems to me to be common among all these types. And that is that a deep map ultimately is flexible. It's inviting you to explore. It's in allowing you to take different paths through the map and to know where those paths are. It is user-centric, and it's supporting different kind of views. In other words, different people will be using the same map, and you will be able to see the way they have used it. Therefore, it's path traceable, enabling you to kind of construct a narrative flow through the information in the map. It's open, and it's admitting new material because the map is never closed. It's never a finished product. And ultimately, I think it's immersive, evoking experience. We had at my center an NEH Advanced Institute grant, and we held one. It was called Deep Maps and Spatial Narratives and Deep Maps. Mia Ridge, who from the British Library, attended that as a participant. And this is kind of the way she envisions it. She's a computer scientist by training, and she sees it as kind of this universe of data out there where we're continually curating that data, and we're feeding it up into this, through this deep map, to construct this spatial narrative. This narrative of things that never lets us forget that we are in a physical world. And it keeps us tied to that, as well as to whatever other metaphorical worlds that we want to call into play. But at the same time, we're adding more data to that all the time. And that becomes the way in which we think about what we're trying to do here. Trevor Harris, my colleague at West Virginia, has kind of constructed what he thinks of as the geospatial web's deep mapping platform, and it's something like I think we'd probably have, where you're accessing the deep map really through a series of apps. All of these things are being integrated, and with storyboards and display mediums and whatnot. My center is going to have a chance to try to implement this through a large grant challenge, a large grant that I'm pretty sure we're about to receive. And I may come back here 3 years later and say, let's scratch that one, okay? And let me show you what it really looks like. But this NEH Advanced Institute grappled with a number of frameworks. We gave them sets of data to work with over this 2.5-week period. And put them in teams and challenge them to think about, okay, now you have to ask this question. It turns out these data were all from a large Indianapolis-based project that we had done on religion and urban culture. And so think, how would you express the deep map in a real way, given the technologies we have available now? One of the ways they came up with was just a WordPress site, where now notice you've got a map, you've got the data, you've got text, you have a timeline over here, and something of an event stream that shows you the thickness of the data for any of those particular parts, how much data you have about this particular place you're interested in. Or it could be a traditional GIS platform that has been modified, and this is doing much the same thing, but just with a different kind of framework. Again, where you're pulling forth kind of archival and data-based information. You're linking them to images. You're looking at the way that you're looking at various scales across here. You're seeing an event stream that says, again, we've got this much data for this particular place at this particular time. But at other times we're pretty thin on those kind of data. And ideally, you could go into that event stream and see what those data were. That's the way they had imagined it. This is the work of Mei-Po Kwan that I have simply augmented with some things to show that she was mapping in a space-time cube, mapping the movement of Muslim women in Columbus, Ohio, using time diaries following 9/11, seeing how far they moved away from their homes, whether they moved away from their neighborhoods. But you can imagine a framework like that where at any one of these points on these lines you could go into it and see what was being, where they were and what they were thinking or what they were doing at that particular time. Or it could be, this is the work of Nicholas Bausch, who's now at the University of Oklahoma. He's a geography. And this is an e-book, a born digital product, just recently published by Stanford University Press. And so maybe the enhanced e-book. And here what he's done is he's taken some classic photographs of the Grand Canyon. I think they were taken in the early part of the 20th century. And he's decided to use GIS, viewshed analysis, to see what the photographer could see. What was he looking at? And what was he not looking at? What could he not see in this image? Because these have become cultural icons, iconic images of the Grand Canyon. But then he's got his narrative over here. And it's a narrative in which space is deeply embedded in that. And the interesting thing, of course, is you can privilege one of these three over the other. You can move the image over to where the narrative is, blow it up and move the narrative, minimize the narrative. You can do any of those kind of ways. Again, it's a way of thinking about how do you make this a richer text. Or what's happening in a law firm in St. Louis is they're using Second Life as a virtual resource environment. And it's a spatially referenced thing where when they want to find certain materials, they don't use a filing system, they enter a virtual world in which they can begin to find these particular things that are segmented, as I understand it, by time and space, time and geography. Or the immersive environments. This one is coming oddly, interestingly enough, from Bavaria, from the State Criminal Investigation Unit. They were faced with a problem of fading memories and uncertain memories when trying to prosecute Holocaust, not survivors, what am I thinking about? Agents of the Holocaust. And they were Holocaust survivors, or now in their 80s and 90s. And what they were finding was that when they took people to trial or when they investigate, there were all these conflicting memories about where people were and what could they see. So they created this virtual environment of Auschwitz and Birkenau so that they can place themselves now where the witness said that they were, and could they have seen what they purported to see. I think that's a very interesting use of a spatial environment, not a GIS environment. Or the BEMA project coming out of the University of Minnesota, which is trying to understand the experience that a speaker in an ancient Roman forum would have had in trying to address this. You have a great deal of control in this particular environment. You will know how far your voice can carry because of acoustical physics that are being employed here. And you begin to get something of the experience of the space. And it's something that you knew had taken place. Well, I've shown you a couple of virtual reality examples, and I know that some of my colleagues, many of whom I respect highly, scoff at virtual reality as a way in which to do scholarship. But first of all, it's a reality. It is here. Anytime you've got a multi-billion-dollar company investing heavily in virtual reality like Facebook is doing, you can bet that it's going to be part of our world for quite some time. But the important thing is that virtual reality is an experiential medium. It's not a peripheral. It's not a game. It's a way that allows us to evoke emotion. With VR, you see not only with your eyes, but your entire body. You begin to sense things and feel things that something like a GIS, or it offers presence, the sense of being in touch with reality, and uses experience as a counterpoise and a complement to meaning. Well, if virtual reality is part of where deep mapping is moving, and I think that it is, there are things that are happening out there that are going to allow us to construct within this environment the spatial narratives that we know we're going to have to construct as scholars. Ultimately, these narratives have to feed an argument because that's what we do, right? That's the only way that we have currency within our world. But there are things like time geography and text mapping I've already mentioned. There are questions to be answered, and I've listed them here. How do we capture experiential and metaphorical space? Well, I've shown you how Charles Travis tried to do it, and I think there are those other kind of experiments. How do we understand the situatedness of the narrator? And there are some things that are developing in disciplines far outside of ours that I think are going to be part of what we will rely upon. And I'm thinking here of Watson paths. You know the IBM computer Watson, mainly because it won Jeopardy, right? But what it's done, interestingly enough, in the medical field, recognizing that clinicians have a difficult time not just keeping up with the literature, but trying to use the literature to make an accurate diagnosis. So it has, by working with clinicians and through machine learning algorithms, it's created a way in which once a clinician feeds the symptoms into this program, the program parses the literature for those symptoms. And interestingly enough, what it does is it kind of narrows those into sets of choices. And at every one of these vertical things you see here, that's where the machine learning algorithm has made a choice. But the clinician can go back in and see what that choice was. That's the important thing. When we talk about how do we make a deep map path traceable, how do we manage the massive amount of information that we might, it may be something like this. It may be something that allows us to chart and to see what the things that we have, choices we've made. I think because of this, there are new opportunities that are opening. Things that we could have only imagined in our past, everything from life paths to gaming and simulations or practice theory, and ultimately the understanding of deep contingencies. So the future of spatial humanities is going to be this. It's a unique postmodern scholarship, at least in my view. Real and conceptual space is the integrating and animating framework that allows us then to produce a history that is not only bound up in a rational empirical world, but it's all set beside that is the visual and experiential world, the way in which we as human beings actually grapple with the world and with the space. So, in some ways, I think what the spatial humanities is beginning to embrace is phenomenology, which is beginning to make a comeback of sorts within the academy. But I think we also have to remember what William Gibson said. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And it's certainly, I think it's becoming distributed now to the humanities in ways that it has not been earlier. So thank you very much.
Thank you for an excellent talk. Questions?
So this was really wonderful. It was a wonderful kind of, if I may say, mapping out the GIS and spatial humanities landscape. But one thing does concern me.
Mm-hmm.
So scholars, I will say 95% of them, are going to write their scholarship, and they're going to publish that scholarship in articles and in books. PhDs will be given for dissertations, not for websites. Young scholars who are going up for tenure will not get tenure with a website. They will only get tenure with a first book in the foreseeable future. On the other hand, Spatial Humanities opens up a world that is ever more exciting, but much of what you're showing us is ever more far away from things that can be published in a book or an article. And so what worries me a little bit is that Spatial Humanities runs in the direction of the "this is so amazing," while young scholars have to make their way in print. And they're losing Spatial Humanities because Spatial Humanities isn't meeting them at that place where they have to publish in print. That's my worry.
And I understand that. And I think for some time yet, although I don't know, I think it probably will come faster than we imagine, these will run in parallel tracks. But it's why I do Spatial Humanities and why I publish books on Spatial Humanities and why I do articles on Spatial Humanities. I do both. And I think that's probably going to be the track that scholars do. But remember, we are raising a generation now. In fact, the generation's already been raised. It's already here, and increasingly so, that are very familiar and comfortable with these tools and are increasingly visual in the way that they learn. Increasingly visual. What happens when 20 years from now, those are the people who are now scholars?
20 years ago, the AHA was giving prizes for those dissertations with e-books. And those scholars who were unfortunate enough to trust them on that had a rude awakening.
And some of them did, and some of them didn't. There are institutions now. Indiana is one that is beginning to accept digital scholarship as a legitimate practice. I mean, as a legitimate thing. The difficulty, of course, is, in my view, is not on the substance of the argument. It's because I think increasingly my colleagues are understanding that the work that is required and the insights that are gained can be equal to those in a more traditional way of doing scholarship. The difficulty comes with persistence, with the persistence of the product. The book, you can go to the book and I can pull off a shelf a book that was published 150 years ago, and it's still in the same form that it was in. And we don't have a way of guaranteeing that in the digital world yet. That's our big challenge, because so much of the work depends upon a technology. I mean, you can kind of wrap it up and put it up on the shelf, but there's no guarantee that the technology that is embedded in it will continue to work, or that, for instance, a person who would have made a VHS as a product increasingly would find that very difficult even to see it any longer. So I think that's the real issue. And that's what, of course, people in library and information science are grappling with all the time.
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, I think that's really a good concern to bring up, especially for the grad students in the room. You shouldn't go into this thinking we're in a post-press world or a post-book world or something like that, in terms of if you're lucky enough to even get a tenure track job, what's going to get you tenure is, in 8 out of 10 institutions, is not going to be anything that's published digitally. But I think conversely, so I think the talk that you gave is a sort of amazing overview of where we're going. But I think, I don't know, we'll see. Would you agree also simultaneously, though, that you could pretty much pick a field in the humanities, and there is still so much basic, like low-hanging fruit that is just ready to be picked with the most primitive, simple GIS.
No question about that. No question.
So, I mean, you don't even have to talk about after GIS, but you could talk about, the simplest GIS
right.
You could possibly imagine that you could set up in, with an Excel spreadsheet, and you could make a major impact if you're smart about it, right? I
agree with that. I mean, I don't mean for anything I said to suggest that that GIS is not a powerful tool, it's not an important tool, and that even the kind of most elementary work in the field oftentimes can pay rich dividends. The difficulty that I see, though, is that we need to come to grips in a critical way with what GIS is. Because I see historians oftentimes when using GIS doing the same things that geographers did 20 years ago, using it quite uncritically without any understanding of what some of the assumptions of the technology are. And thinking that because you placed a point on a map that somehow or a series of points on a map that somehow that has revealed something to you. We just have to be careful about that. So I guess if I were designing a curriculum, I would make sure that spatial thinking and visual thinking were part of that, because that's going to be important regardless of the geospatial tool you might use. Yes?
I have a question kind of following up on some of these, not necessarily more pessimistic perspectives, but to turn it to the optimistic side. What is your experience with bringing the gospel to the unenlightened? So it's taken me quite some time to realize that what I've been struggling to do for 10 years has arrived quite some time ago. But I'm curious about how you bring these tools to people who might otherwise be very busy.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just put it that way. So, how do you meet your constituency halfway?
Mm-hmm.
I simply note that there are very few of our colleagues here today. And so what is the outreach? What are the outreach techniques that you found particularly successful?
Well, I'll use a couple of examples. One is with the Digital Atlas of American Religion, which we recognize that one of the problems with using the data set itself within the technology, the mapping technology, was that the data set only showed you religion at a county level. That was the only way it was being reported by the body of statisticians for the religious bodies of the United States. And what the tool allowed you to do was to map that, but it was mapping it in chloropleth maps, which showed you only the most dominant religion for the particular county. Now, Marion County, where in the IUPUI is an urban county. It's got about between 95 and 120 different faith bodies or faiths within that county. But it shows up that it's a Catholic county, which is correct. It is predominantly Catholic county, but Catholics constitute 18% of the believing population. And the believing population is only half of the total population. So that's a really misleading, isn't it? So we realized that, okay, how do you get to the diversity that is embedded within this county, and how do you show that to people in a way that allows them to grapple it? But it wasn't through GIS. It was through Google tools, or a variety of different ways in which, including bubble charts, so that we could show how it was that over time, I don't know if you've seen a bubble chart or not, but it allows you to put all of these bodies, and each of them constitute a little bubble, which grow or diminish over time as you go across a time scale. And so those are tools that are intuitive tools. I mean, people can see that and they understand what's taking place. So that's part of the way we've done that. And our community information system, my center, we do a lot of, it's a 25-person center. We do $3 million worth of projects every year. They're not all spatial humanities projects. In fact, spatial humanities projects are by far, they would never pay the freight. But with our community information system, which is the nation's largest and most comprehensive, we recognized that what we had done when we started, which was essentially to take a GIS, put it on the web, and allow people to do their own mapping, that this wasn't at all suitable for people. That they could get a lot of really terrific information from that, because we had 40 different databases we were drawing from. You could map it down to the city block level all the way to the metropolitan area if you wanted to. But people didn't have the spatial tools, the spatial thinking tools, that allowed them to even ask intelligent questions about that. So what we realized, we had to start presenting data to them in ways that address the questions that they had. And we've done that through dashboards and profiles and a whole variety of different kind of ways to make sure that we were not anticipating the questions that were asked, although we do in part, but we were asking them what kind of questions they wanted answered. And we were serving then to translate the data for them into something that was meaningful. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think that's what you have to do. But to get back to, just 1 second, to the issue of, yeah, I am an evangelist, I guess, in this sense, and I do proselytize. But what's been interesting to me when I've given talks like this is I will frequently have calls or emails within a relatively short period of time. In fact, I just got off a call earlier this week with a fellow in Germany who was wanting to do a deep map. And in fact was trying to do a deep map, and he wanted my thoughts and perspectives upon that. And so this is happening. I mean, it's not because of me, but because of a variety of other people that are picking this up. And I do think that you're seeing an increased amount of interest. Yes.
So I really enjoyed your talk, and I think as a grad student, it's really interesting to hear a lot of the concerns that have been brought up, especially in the helmet, because I think that's something that we think a lot, quite a bit about jobs, about tenure, promotion, these kinds of
Sure.
things. So what would your advice be for grad students in this kind of world where we increasingly want to do this kind of work, but we're not sure how it's going to be seen?
Well, I think if I were in your position, what I would do is I would learn as much as I could about this technology. I would decide whether or not it was suitable for the problem that I was interested in. It's not going to be suitable for a lot of problems. We have to understand that. If it is suitable for it is, use it, but publish in a traditional way. And a lot of people will think, well, gosh, that's a lot of work to do. But in fact, it's actually not much more work than what you would normally be doing. It's going to do several things for you, in my view. It's going to, first of all, it's going to give you something that other people do not have. And you look at the number of digital humanities advertisements that are out there, it's increasing all the time. And so that gives you a leg up in a market when you can do something like that. Secondly, it puts you in conversation with other disciplines in a way that you will not be able to do if you simply stick within your discipline. It will give you not only expose you to a language of those other disciplines, and you begin to understand something about the assumptions that undergird the way they view the world, but it puts you in the position of being able to translate between your discipline and theirs. And ultimately, I think you begin to enrich your vocabulary so that you increasingly can translate. If, in fact, the university is finally catching up with the world and moving toward an interdisciplinary way of doing things, which I think it is, and I know Vanderbilt is grappling with that, and we've got to come up with the institutional structures, and most of the time those are budgetary structures that have got to recognize and reward structures that do this. But increasingly, that puts you in an incredibly valuable position. My center has grown and flourished, I think, because I've always argued that the best place to be, and our center tries to go between the university and the community. I mean, we do a lot of that. I always want to be in the middle. The British learned a long time ago that the middleman that makes all the profit, right? And so I think in some sense, being in the middle, in that nexus position, as a scholar, puts you in a very enviable place in the university of the next 10 and 15 and 20 years. Because there are not many people who are doing that. So that's what I would argue. Just don't think, to do that though, you've got to move outside of your disciplinary hat. I mean, take that off and think about what you're doing in kind of non-substantive terms, in procedural terms, if I could use it.
Well, we can continue the conversation and questions over wine and cheese if anybody would like to linger for a brief reception. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.